Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as cEDH. I am one of your hosts, Lyndon, aka Noobzors, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Matt, aka Null.
How's it going, everyone?
Reed, aka Sick Robot.
How you doing?
And Morgan, aka Spleenface.
What's up?
In this episode, we're going to be covering threat assessment at the request of someone on the GitRog server. They wanted to get a nice resource for threat assessment in cEDH, and you know what? I figured let's give them a nice podcast they can listen to. So that was I think that was Kaylani on the GitRog server. So shout out to you, Kaylani. Yeah, but before we get into that, what have you guys been up to since the last episode? Boop, boop, boop.
Oh, well, went to Montreal to play some Commander.
Oh, you did too? Oh, what a coincidence. Yeah. I headed out there as well.
Wow.
No way, yeah, me too.
I'm pretty sure I went to Montreal as well.
I would have known if you went. You probably didn't. Yeah.
I saw three people wearing the exact same shirt as me.
Yeah, oh my god.
Crazy, right?
What a coincidence.
Yeah, no. So, yes, memes aside, we all went to Montreal, JP Montreal. Super fun. We went with Morgan, Matt, and Reed came up from Toronto, picked me up along the way. We all got an Airbnb, jammed some games with some friends. We got some people come up from. So I'm in Kingston, Ontario, which I'm now shilling a meme that Kingston, Ontario is the largest cEDH play group in the world because we have at least 10 regular cEDH players. Sometimes more, so that's that. I feel like that eclipses most cEDH players
twice a week.
But
wow,
that meme aside, yeah, we had some people from other people from Kingston go up to Montreal as well. So some regulars from my play group there here, and then we also jammed with Shaper, Lurker, Pongo,
Scotty.
Come on, guys, Scotty.
Okay, Scotty too. Yeah, wow.
Okay, here we go. Here's the list of names, and let's not fuck anything up. Scuba Steve, Drac Paladin. Okay, guys, help me out here. Francis.
I thought you had a list. Yeah.
Francis got a sweet Aminatou primer.
Yes. Fletcher.
Okay.
Yes.
We're getting there. We'll get there. Don't worry.
I'm thinking. I'm picturing the round table in my head.
God, we should have just. Oh, we also saw Jan from the Spike Feeders.
Did.
He was judging the tournament.
Jan was great. Didn't get a lot of time to play, but we got to annoy him with weird rules questions.
Yeah, we did.
Okay. Well, you know what? There's a nice cEDH group photo that we can link to like a little.
It'll be the background of the video on YouTube. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
But yeah, it was lots of fun. We went out to. It's kind of a little, just quick little story. Yeah, so Pongo booked a nice like dinner for people, and we showed up. And it was way fancier than we were expecting. So we all just gotten out of like the GP, and like I was basically wearing pajamas, like track pants and a hoodie.
Morgan's in shorts.
Yeah. So we're like outside of this restaurant. I'm looking in, as people are wearing suit jackets. The menu, everything on the menu started with a the. It was the egg, the beef.
There were 3 options of tasting menus.
Yeah.
the wine menu alone was larger than the food menu.
Yeah, quite a bit more expensive.
And we were all in matching Into the North t-shirts.
It was really cute, yeah.
Yeah, good times. Yeah, it was loads of fun. Always a pleasure to jam with people who you don't get to see that often.
Oh, 100%.
And I guess also I'll shout out to Zach, Keegan, and Josh from QMTG, which is the Queen's Magic the Gathering Club in Kingston, Ontario. So I just they were there as well. I just want to make sure I'm giving all shout outs where they're due. But yeah,
that's a good time though. Got a lot of good games in.
Yeah,
I got some people good. I wanted to test out new tech, but then somebody windfalled me and it was spoiled. And now it's forever spoiled, and they'll never get that moment back.
Okay. Well, I think that about covers it for Montreal recap, even though that's kind of all over the place. But
It was a bit brief,
whatever.
but it was a good time.
We've been asked to keep these episodes shorter, so we're not gonna.
We're making the effort, okay?
Yeah.
It's hard sometimes.
So let's jump into housekeeping. And in housekeeping, we have 3 new patrons. So big shout out to Dan S.
Another big shout out to Sean K.
And a third big shout out to Wes D.
You
Thanks,
rock.
guys. Oh, God, I wanted to just like the command zone.
Got 'em.
God damn it. It's
We're
so
all
baked
thinking
in.
it. Someone might as well just say it.
I know.
Just let it out.
Yeah.
God, wait till
But
they
you
copyright
get-
that.
but
We're gonna
seriously-
get fucking striked.
We're going to get sued.
We're gonna get
Holy shit.
striked.
But seriously, you guys are awesome.
You guys are great.
Yeah, we're going to start
Fantastic.
saying, you guys are awesome
I mean,
instead of you
I'm
rock.
still
That's,
continuously impressed and entirely surprised that people will continue to support us like this.
yeah, it's a huge help. Again, as we say in the closing episode, at the close of the episode each week, helps pay for equipment and editing, and we're going to try to use that to improve the show for you guys. So yeah, without further ado, hop into new developments, and boy, have there actually been a lot of new
There's a
developments
lot.
since the last episode.
we went
yeah.
away for Montreal, and just like everybody came out of the woodwork, and we're like, all right, we're gonna publish all our stuff right now.
Yeah, so I want to kick things off by giving a huge shout out to Forge10. That's his Discord username, and he's Forgotten Kane on Reddit. Just dropped a double Gitrog primer. So it's a primer for Double Titan, or like the Double Titan based Gitrog, which Forge and I have discussed on the Gitrog server, which we kind of think is the new standard list, which kind of feels weird to say because it's not really something that you get to just kind of decide on. It's kind of whatever people are using the most is kind of the standard list. But we kind of think this is the direction that the deck should be going. So yeah, he dropped a primer for Double Titan, and as well as the Gaia's Blessing, Gitrog deck, which is one. Actually, did we give a shout out to him for the 20 easy steps in the last episode?
I think that was like just after we recorded.
Okay, well
so
then
we should definitely do
double
that too.
double feature here. So Forge also dropped a 20 easy steps for a Titanless Gitrog combo. So that's an evolution on my 60 step line, which was, very complicated and involved lots of expensive cards. And Forge managed to simplify it a lot. So people don't need to worry about, having chains of Mephistopheles and LED and things like that when trying to do 60 easy steps, which is used for comboing through an in-play Anafenza, or if your Titan gets exiled. So you no longer need that. You can use the 20 easy steps by Forge. And then Forge also wrote a very nice primer on the Gaia's Blessing build of Gitrog. And yeah, Forge has been putting in a mad amount of work into Gitrog resources lately, and everyone who plays Gitrog is very thankful for it.
I mean, it's a deck that always needs more resources, right?
I mean, yeah. It's one of the most popular decks of all time in cEDH. Continually, people are constantly coming onto that deck, and then it's not necessarily super hard to pilot for the most part. It's kind of just an A-B combo, but the loops themselves can be a bit more complicated, and definitely people can get confused. So having those resources
people
available
can definitely
is
get
nice.
confused.
Oh, people can 100% get confused playing that deck.
Yeah, shout out to our editor Roadkill.
Don't worry, buddy. You'll learn the lines eventually. I believe.
Yeah.
just gotta spend a bit more. Hey, look,
Alright.
you got 2 more primers that just came out. You got some more reading material to get through.
Speaking of more primers, we have more primers to discuss. So who
We
wants
do
to
have
talk
more
about
primers
this
to
next one?
discuss.
So this next primer is by a friend of the show, Keegan, showing off his Urza brew. Pretty classic mana denial Urza. He goes over some pretty spicy new cards like Mystic Forge and Mystic Sanctuary. yeah, as he puts it, Urza got hit by the Paradox Engine ban, known as the Dark Times, and then so this is what we have.
Yeah, Keegan. Matt and Morgan used to regularly jam against Keegan when they were still at Queen's University, but I am still I'm not sure if I want to say pleasure or displeasure of jamming against Keegan. Shout out to Keegan. Yeah, so that's he's too many tapers on Reddit. So if you want to find his primer, we'll definitely be linking to that in the show notes. So I get to regularly see this deck, and it's interesting in that it differs from the standard list, which Reed curates the standard list with Shaper, Siggy, and someone else.
Lurker.
That's right.
Which we are. We're not consistently updating, but we're getting there. We have a lot of stuff to get through first, but we'll get there. Don't worry about it. But this is I can
definitely vouch for Keegan in the sense that he has been playing mono blue. He's suffered through Teferi. And been jamming all tons of games with Urza, so he's got a different opinion, not the orthodoxy, but it's definitely worth listening to, certainly to get a different perspective, because he has some solid experience with it.
And as a connoisseur of Urza, I'd recommend checking it out. I think there are definitely things to take away from pretty much every different Urza build, because there are a lot of them. And I think you should definitely shop around and check them all out. If you're looking to play one.
All right, and before we get into the last little bit of new developments, we've got yet another primer from someone on this podcast.
That's
me. Is it me?
No, it's me for once.
It's Morgan.
It's not always about you, Reed. I wrote a primer for Hullen, Teller of Tales. Who is?
I'm sorry, who is that?
Hullen, Teller of Tales. Who is?
I didn't get that. It's Tulane.
Tulane,
Gotcha.
Teller of Tales.
Anyways, if you read the primer, you learn how to pronounce it. And he's one of the new Brawl commanders. He's a Bant 5-drop, and he enables all sorts of crazy, wacky combos and does silly things with Lotus Cobras. It's an interesting deck, I think, because you're you're obviously slower than something like a Thrasios Tymna Flash Hulk, and you don't have black, but in exchange for that, you get the deck's extremely resilient to hate. You can basically ignore Null Rod and Rest in Peace type effects, and you can even win through Cursed Totem, which there aren't a lot of decks that can actually win through all three of those hate pieces. So, might be an option for your meta. We'll link that down below and check it out if you're interested.
Mm-hmm. And
it is also I do want to mention it's the one actually real Allurin deck in the format, because people have been trying to make that card work for decades, centuries at this point, but Hullen does it. He makes it work.
And so, Morgan, also you want to shout out Gauntlet?
Yeah. Okay, so Gauntlet is a life counter app. Not the first, certainly won't be the last, but this one is particularly awesome because it has a feature where you can store your decks associated with your account, and you can access other people's decks associated with their accounts, so you can record games against other people. And then that's all that data is tracked.
Certain pod compositions.
Yeah, pod compositions. Right? That data is tracked against, if I play a game and I mark that Reed was my opponent, then that game will appear for Reed as well. He can see that, and it just provides a full, that, all of that, and it also has a timer, which none of the other ones seem to have. So that's just gravy.
That's sweet. Yeah, nice way to track stats.
Is it both iOS and useful. Android, or?
Unfortunately, right now it is only iOS. It's a 2-person team, and it was only released about a month ago, and they're still adding features. And then they said once they are satisfied that they have the app more or less complete on iOS, they'll look into Android.
All right.
Nice.
And so our last little segment of new developments is. It's not really so we're not really doing set review episodes anymore, because we don't think it's worth it to take up a full episode every month on just spoiler season, because it feels like we're in, perpetual spoiler season at this point.
Spoiler season all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, just especially over the last summer with all the brawl decks, commander decks, all this stuff. But yeah, so we're deciding we're just gonna maybe, every new set, unless it's something like insane where there's a million different cards we need to do, and we'll maybe devote more of a topic to it. We're just gonna pick our favorite card from the set for cEDH, and maybe give a brief little discussion about it in new developments.
I trust that there are more than enough competent other content creators who are doing set reviews that you don't need to get all of that content here. I'm sure if you want full in-depth set reviews on every single set, there are other people. I think the lab men do set reviews.
Yeah.
I think Spike Feeders have done one or two, right? Unless I'm completely misremembering that. Yeah, there are definitely more than enough out there.
Yeah, and set reviews are kind of better when they're scrollable and reviewable and all that, referenceable.
So just check out Shaper's.
A bit harder to do with
Shaper's set updates.
Update post. Yeah. Basically, the best text post related to set reviews every set. Yeah. So without further ado, Matt, you want to kick things off with your favorite card?
Sure. My favorite card from Eldraine is Fey Burrow Elder, which is 1 green and a white creature, treefolk druid. Has vigilance, and Fey Burrow Elder gets +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control. For each color among permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color if you tap it. So you might think Bloom Tender, you're right, but it's a bit better.
You are correct.
It's a bit better, right? It can kind of beat people.
God.
Tymna, attacker and blocker.
Dude, I'm so sad I had to give this card up as my favorite because I had to rep another one, but God, Favor is so good.
It's a sick card.
It's a house.
Yeah. Definitely Gilded Drakeable.
100% Gilded Drakeable. I do just want to say, because I'm not sure if people realize just how good this is in Tymna Thrasios. Like most cards, but specifically this one. Just vigilance plus big body plus tapping for 4 mana is really good.
Who would have thought that vigilance would be relevant text in cEDH? Oh man, what has Tymna done to this meta?
And also,
that is the new meta.
One thing I definitely didn't appreciate when I first saw this card, but have in playing it, is particularly when you're trying to make a lot of mana with it. When you curve into it on turn 2 off a dork, it's almost better than Bloom Tender sometimes, because that 1 mana on turn 2 rarely does much, but having that extra mana the turn you untap with it is super helpful.
And not having to have the Tymna already in play to make white, because white's already usually the most difficult color to make off of a Bloom Tender in those decks. So just having it stapled to the card already and pre-existing.
Yeah.
Oh, also dodges Pyroclasm if you have a Thrasios on the board, which is way too good.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Which is unreal.
Okay, Reed, you're up.
All right.
What's your favorite
so
card?
I had to pass up a bunch of them. I had to pass up a bunch of other favorite cards that other people got to take here to do this one. But my favorite card of the set for all formats, not just cEDH, is Mystic Sanctuary. Mystic Sanctuary is a land island type. That's a good one. Obviously, rules text tapped out of blue. Mystic Sanctuary enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands. Note, no basic on that card. When Mystic Sanctuary enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. So, fetchable Noxious Survival is not bad.
Yeah.
In general. So I'm not incredibly excited about this for cEDH. I think it does have purposes and does have usages.
You get to run it in just Urza for free.
So first of all, you get to run it in low color blue decks. Also, it combos with a couple of mono blue commanders, which is pretty neat. So old Kefnet combos with it plus a turn spell, which is pretty awesome. Because you pay for it, and he also has the weird ability to bounce a land when he does that, and it's optional. So you can just bounce the Mystic Sanctuary and do that.
Mystic Sanctuary in Yuriko Like you can use.
It's also not a
there's
bad
like
one.
the Kamigawa block had the Moonfolk. There's a couple 2-drop Moonfolks with flying, which obviously you want like evasive weenies and Yuriko to get the ninjutsu. But they also have an ability for like 2 mana to just bounce a land. So if you're bouncing Mystic Sanctuary when you're just comboing with turn spells, seems pretty good.
Or when you're just putting fat stuff in the grave and then putting them back on top and murdering people.
Yeah,
that also works. But so that, and then Moloku combos with it in mono blue. And then it's also not
Seems
terrible.
Worse than Kefnet.
Yeah, honestly, it does. Also, Kefnet's. I'm gonna show another deck here because we're gonna link this one later. Also, because I love this deck way too much. Yeah, I forgot about it until recently. It's great. Sorry, taking up time. Old Kefnet is awesome because he's indestructible, so you get to polymorph him without losing him. Which is
Nice.
fantastic because
cool.
it means that with Mystic Sanctuary, you can polymorph him for value to get like a Jin-Katax or something out of deck, and then you can Mystic Sanctuary to put it back on top, like by bouncing it and replaying it with Kefnet, and then polymorph him again to get even more stuff out of deck. So you have like this
Nice.
recursive polymorph engine to just like keep getting like Jin-Kataxias, Consecrated Sphinx, Nezahal out of
Does
the out of
Kefnet
the deck.
return a land as a cost?
No, it's
Nope,
an
it's an
optional part
optional
of the
like you
effect.
can,
You
you
may
can even
return
do,
it.
you
Optional.
can do Tide Spout. Yeah, you do Tide Spout shit
Yes.
too.
And it's also,
All
again,
right.
he's optional, so you can just use him as a bad Thrasios if you wanted to without bouncing the land. It's great.
Nice.
It's so cool. But last part about this card, it's insane in Pauper. It's so awesome in Pauper.
Yeah.
First week this was legal. I brought it, which was this past week. I brought it to a Pauper tournament in an Esper Familiars deck, and I got to utter a sentence that I never thought I'd ever get to say in Pauper. Which was, it was turn 5, and I got to say, I'd like to demonstrate a loop.
Oh yeah. Sweet.
And then I drew my deck, made infinite mana, and killed him.
Nice. All right, so I guess I'm up next. So my pick from the set is Oakhame Adversary, aka Grob, and Grob is as he's affectionately known, stands for Green Bob. Oakhame Adversary is an elf warrior creature for 3 and a green, and he is a 2/3, and he reads, this spell costs 2 generic less to cast if your opponent controls a green permanent. It has Death Touch, and whenever Oakhame Adversary deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Yeah, so I think this is the closest to Bob of the fake Bobs,
Yep.
which is like Mindblade Render, there's
Ruined Raider.
Ruin Ranger. What's the
Grimflayer.
empty card one, or empty hand one? The
Asylum
Madness one?
Visitor?
Asylum Wanderer? Asylum Visitor?
Asylum
Asylum
Seeker. I
Seeker.
think
No,
that's
it's,
like
no,
Morgan's
it's
right, yeah.
Asylum.
Oh, Visitor.
Visitor.
Asylum Visitor.
Yeah, Visitor.
He did
Okay, I was
say
right
that.
the first time.
And there's Painseer as well.
Yeah, so Oakhame, the best of these, 2/3 is a very relevant stat
For
line.
2 mana,
That three
too, most of the time.
Yeah, three toughness, being able to not, trade with Tymnos. And the fact that he has Death Touch means that people will not be throwing Thrasios in front of him
God,
very often.
Dude, I can swing through Gitrog finally in my Tymna deck.
Yeah, exactly. Oakhame gets to swing through a lot of things because people are going to be very reluctant to trade their creatures for your card.
Just the fact that I can't be safe with my Thrasios anymore is
You can't.
It's dark
we can't
times.
we can't have the Tymna circle jerk of cast Tymna, cast Thrasios, block each other's Tymnas, swing at everybody else.
And you also, you can't, often with things like this, someone will eventually decide to multi-block it. Like, oh, I'll block with, like a 2/2 and a dork, and I'll lose one of them, but it's worth it to get it off the board. But this, you're losing both things you double block with.
Yeah.
And having a green permanent in play is the most non-conditional condition I've ever heard.
It's that's so close to just if somebody else has a land in play, cast it for 2.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want to just take note of how many times on your turn 1 or 2 someone else has a dork in play.
It's not even bad on turn 3. You
Yeah.
cast it for 2 on turn 3, you still have a mana up if you didn't have a dork.
Yeah. Damn. Okay, our final card, Morgan.
Our final card is Corridor Monitor. and it is it is an artifact creature that casts for 1 and a blue. It's a 1/4, and it has, when Corridor Monitor enters the battlefield, untap target artifact or creature you control. So it's a little pod chainer, but it's one of the special ones that works with both Vannifar and pod, and also Yisan in decks that run that, because it can untap all of them, unlike the ones that flicker or like Breaching Hippocamp on 4. Or Bounding Krasis, stuff like that. So this just means that pod chains now can start at 1, which is pretty cool for decks like Blue Pod or some of the new like teamer type decks that we've seen people working on with the printing of Dockside Extortionist in Commander 2019. Obviously, this immediately went into my Vannifar list because it's insane in there. And yeah, it's just another little one to have. It's also a 1/4, which is a little surprising.
Lost him to baby.
That's definitely some stats for a 2-drop.
Oh my god!
And the one other thing I've seen, shout out to friend of the podcast Tom for this one, was because it's a 2-drop, you can do interesting pod or Vannifar lines using Renegade Rallier as your 3-drop, which is obviously like a much more useful card than
that's
Pestermite
neat.
or something like that. So that was,
and it also
a whole neat piece
layers,
of tech.
quote unquote layers, but it layers well with some Hulk piles. So like it's a card that's useful for both a Hulk pile and a pod line. Sort of neat.
And because they're artifacts, if you can't attack after making infinite of them with Kiki Jiki, you can tap them to Urza to make infinite mana and cast your
God.
All right.
Wow. Cool.
So that
deck.
wraps it up for our favorite cards from Eldraine. And let's get into the meat and potatoes of the episode: threat assessment. So we've got some bullet points lined up here, but I think let's just tackle the low hanging fruit for threat assessment.
Well,
and that's going to be.
I think the first thing we have to
go
say
ahead.
is that listening to us talk about threat assessment for the next half hour to an hour is not going to teach you everything you need to know.
No,
and
not
a
at
lot
all.
of it comes from just playing a bunch of games, experience, learning the hard way sometimes.
Most
so just
times.
get that caveat
Yeah,
out of the way.
most
This
times.
doesn't make you an expert.
But hopefully you can take some advice, or hopefully we say something new that you weren't familiar with,
You can get
or just remind
a
you
fresh
to,
take on a way to think about assessment.
get some
and threat.
Exactly.
building blocks going. Get a good foundation laid down.
Okay, so back to what I was saying. Let's tackle the low-hanging fruit of threat assessment. That's going to be knowing the decks you're up against. So just being able to identify you're sitting down across from a Tasker deck, a Zur deck, and a Kess deck. What might you see, right? If you see a Tasker deck, right, being able to kind of in your mind reference the cards you're going to see, what kinds of win cons are they going to be doing. So if anyone here saw a Tasker deck, what do you think their win con is going to be?
So they obviously have a scepter in the deck, right?
Scepter, yeah.
So they
Question.
obviously have a
Don't
scepter.
That's the
have
first
one.
thing I think of as well.
Potentially they might have some Eldritch Evolution Neoform stuff going on. That's
Razaketh.
it. Like that's a known quantity.
Yeah.
There's a likelihood that they'll have some reanimation happening,
Or potential for ad nauseum.
or ad nauseum. It's fairly safe to assume that like at least a couple of those things are going to be in that deck.
But how many of you guys are going to think when you see a Tasker deck, Doomsday? I, for one, am not going to be assuming that.
Probably not, yeah.
Yeah. So just having that kind of information from experience, and also just you don't have to have run into these decks a lot if you just go onto the cEDH decklist database website.
Which, by the way, did
and
get an
go-
overhaul recently.
I think we mentioned that a couple episodes ago.
No. As in we did another formatting overhaul recently again.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's now all one list instead of needlessly having to split everything into 2 lists. So it's all on one page. You don't have to go to secondary and primary, or like primary and fringe, to find your decks now. You just have to, like, we just have it all on one page, and now we have something called basically just like the recommended list, or they're just tags for recommended by the managers.
All right, yeah, so we'll link to that in the description for the podcast. So if you want to freshen up on what the cEDH meta looks like, what you might expect from certain decks in terms of win cons, interaction and whatnot, definitely check that out. Go through the decks that you're going to see in your meta, or just the most popular decks. So you might want to freshen up on Gitrog, Urza, Thrasios and Tymna, Najeela. Those are some of the most popular decks out there, so you want to know what you're up against.
The first sliver.
I mean, the first sliver's certainly popular.
Is it sliver tribal?
You never know until you find out, huh?
I guess to that point, like, you kind of also want to identify cards that put particular decks on particular win conditions if they aren't necessarily in the meta.
Yes.
Right? You know, if you see a bunch of sliver synergy, they're probably not on food chain. You know, and it goes the opposite way. If you don't see this, the sliver synergy, they're probably on food chain.
Or if you see them cast a demonic consultation, probably not slivers.
A bit of a silly example, but I think
also,
the point gets
to Matt's
across there.
point, like Thrasios and Tymna is often an unknown quantity. We've talked about this in our the Thrasios Tymna problem episode, where they just get a massive advantage of being able to obscure their win con. Are you up against a Breakfast Hulk list, Shuffle Hulk, Sacred Hulk, CST, Cinnamon Toast Mid-Range, or
Cinnamon
whatever
Toast Crunch.
Cinnamon
Toast Crunch. Still Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Name hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Breakfast waffle maple syrup, just something.
Yeah, if they're playing Thrasios and they have a particular amount of creature-based ramp, they're probably on Freed from the Real.
So
it's always a possibility.
I do think that, there is a trick that I think I should mention. Well, it's not like learn this quick trick and you'll suddenly be able to do this and like identify
Thrasios Tymna players hate him. This one simple trick.
But something that you should consider is that or something that the audience at large, the community at large, should consider when trying to identify and like try to minimize the impact of the anonymity of Thras Tymna lists is sort of like learning the typical cards of like what would go into a specific list. Not necessarily like the win cons,
the key
but
differentiators.
Like, yeah, but like stuff like it's not particularly likely that like what's a good one? Something like, yeah, like if okay, so obviously, like, if you see, like, a sack outlet, it's like, oh, well, we know that they're not on CST. We know that they're not on console. We know that they're not on, like, a Hulk deck that doesn't require a sack outlet, right? Like, we know they're specifically on a sack outlet Hulk deck. And that, like, you can narrow that down a lot. But also stuff like, other stuff like, oh, like, we saw a silence. It means they're not on Sacred Hulk. Or, like, a Swords of Plowshare. It means they're not on Sacred Hulk. Or, like, alternatively, you can see a lot of the time, like, stuff like, oh, like, they cast a Pondify. That might imply that they are on Sacred Hulk. Because maybe they don't have the white mana to do stuff like that. So just, like, I'm not giving good examples here, but the idea is to
I think those were great examples.
Like, associate or, like, learn to, like, identify key cards in lists that stand out when you look at the list online. And then try to remember that in games. So like when you see somebody play a card that isn't necessarily a staple across every single deck with the same commander, you go, oh, okay, so I've associated that card with this specific strategy or this specific list, which means that I have a reasonable assumption that, like, hey, maybe they're on that list as opposed to any of these other ones.
Yeah, one of the things I always look for is if they're playing 2 CMC mana rocks, they're almost certainly not on Hulk or Razaketh. That's a hallmark of more CST
that's also, that's a great
style
one.
lists.
Yeah.
It used to be that I would have said that the reverse was true about some of the less good dorks, like the the ones that only produce green. But of course, Reed had to go make an ad nauseum consult list with green dorks in it because we can't have nice things. Another thing to identify if they're not on Hulk at the very least is some of the slower cards. Like if they're playing something like a heuristic study is a big one that goes in more mid-rangey, less fast lists.
Training grounds.
Training grounds is in Sacred Hulk.
It's in Sacred Hulk is the issue with that one, but
I mean, it still does narrow down the field. So you're not going to see training grounds in your breakfast or shuffle.
I think Sacred Grounds is actually a good one, a good example for not necessarily archetype definition, but for specifically like speed definition. It's like a lot of these cards were like you see like, oh, like he cast a compost. That means he's probably not on an aggressive list, right? Like he's not looking to, or they rather, gonna be inclusive here.
Yeah,
they're not looking to go go play fast and like try to get you. Like they're playing compost for a reason, right? They're expecting to draw a few cards off of it at least. So like you reasonably expect they're going slow. On the other hand, like stuff like if people are like scratching the bottom of the barrel for tutors, and you see somebody like I don't know, like play a Grim Tutor or something like that in a 4-color list, you're like, oh, okay. That means they're probably aggressively tutoring for one specific thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also,
anything else to say on this? Or?
CST lists, I don't believe, tend to run Diabolic Intent as much because they're just not on the volume of dorks to make it good. So if you see a Diabolic Intent, it's definitely a more creature-leaning deck. Just things like that. And, you can't always narrow it down 100%, but if you can even eliminate a couple possibilities, or even just make it so you're like, even if you're right, 3/4 of the time, when you call Hulk, that means tutoring for Rest in Peace shuts them down 3/4 of the time, which is still pretty good.
Yeah. So piggybacking up what Morgan was saying there, we're talking about ways to identify which deck people are playing or which specific archetype of the Thrasios Tymna commander pair. But this is a threat assessment episode. So what are you doing with that information? How are you assessing whether or not they're a threat based off the identification of their deck?
Well, I think one of the issues people have with threat assessment is that they often jump immediately into, are they a threat? Like, when are they a threat, as opposed to like, what is it that makes this deck a threat and how does it win? What do I have to watch out for?
And like, how far away are they from having that, right?
Yeah. But it's hard to tell how far away they are from winning unless you know how they're winning in a lot of cases.
Yes.
Just because they aren't a Flash Hulk deck, right? Let's say you reduce it to that they're a CST deck. So you're like, oh, I'm not worried about the 1 in a blue instant speed win. If they drop an early Ristic study, and you're looking at, oh my god, CST here, they could still very well be the threat. It does depend on their board state, cards in hand, as well as the archetype, right? But you're just not going to be worried about them in the winning the game the following turn, most likely.
Yeah, so like I would just I'll pass this off to Morgan afterward because I know he has a lot to say on this. But I would just say like the identifying the archetype or the deck that somebody's on is like, it's less of an inherent marker of threat assessment. Like it's not like, oh, they're on this deck, that means they're immediately a threat right now. It's just, it helps you make decisions based on that, which then lead you to a more accurate assessment of whether or not they're a threat in the game.
Yeah, like evaluating game states, for example, we're talking about the difference between something like a CST or a Flash Hulk. If they're stumbling on mana, for example, that maybe that means you don't have to be as worried about, say, ad nauseum, but 3 mana is more than enough for Flash Hulk to win. So, just saying, oh, they're on Flash Hulk, therefore they're the threat is overly simplistic. You figure out what deck they're on so that you can figure out how they win, so that you can figure out how far they are from that, so that you can figure out how threatening they are.
So along with that, like if there's a Grafdigger's Cage in play or different stacks pieces in play, knowing whether or not that actually affects the deck you're up against is going to factor in largely into your calculation or your process of determining whether or not they are the most threatening player or how close they are to winning.
Though I do have more
like,
to say on stacks pieces later.
And just as a note, like if you're new to this type of assessment, like it might sound a little daunting based on our description, but you actually have, in a real game of cEDH, you have plenty of time to think about these things. Like you have 3 other players' turns to think about exactly these 2 points we've made.
And
so, yeah.
Honestly, as well, sort of piggybacking on that one too. Like it sort of sounds counterintuitive, but like ask around sometimes if you're not sure. Honestly,
I was going to say the same thing. Most people are very interested in you being able to evaluate other people as a legitimate threat.
So don't just ask one person at the table, but like I will do this sometimes where like you ask the entire table, right? Like it's just like, okay, like is this dude a threat? Like, can you guys think of a way for him to win from this position? Can you guys think of like a way that he pulls this off from here? Like what's he likely to have, right?
Yeah, or you sometimes just straight up ask, how is he winning? Is this CST? Is this Flash Hulk? And other people who might be more familiar with the list than yourself will be able to clue you in. Now, going off, I want to also talk about, Reed saying asking the table. It's one thing that's important to understand in cEDH is other people's motives for talking and sharing information with you. The enemy of my enemy is my friend holds true in free for all to an extent, but at the same time they are also still your enemy. So if they are saying something that's going to hurt, or it's information that kind of elucidates the board position or deck position of another player at the table, probably trustworthy. I mean, there's some caveats there where they might be trying to overinflate how much of a threat the other person is, but very seldom are they going to try to lowball it. Now, in terms of if they're the threat, you probably don't want to take their word for it most of the time. Sometimes, I know I've been in this situation myself where some people are clearly evaluating me as a threat, and I'll straight up be like, no, you're evaluating it wrong. Someone else is the larger threat here. And they'll say that because they have a vested interest in not losing the game to, someone. Once I'm like hell-bent on Gitrog and like my graveyard has been like wiped by a rest in peace, someone's like, I'm going to Assassin's Trophy Gitrog. Maybe that's not the best idea. Maybe you should be holding that Assassin's Trophy for someone
then
else.
Again,
oh, man,
you know what?
The classic anti-threat assessment comment in this kind of context is no man, I'm on a bad deck. Like I'm not about to win.
Yeah.
But what if I actually am on a bad deck?
You can try.
One other thing, this has been my experience. Obviously, this will vary from person to person and playgroup to playgroup, but people will very rarely just straight up lie to you. Like they'll obfuscate and they'll twist and they'll exaggerate and they'll conceal, but they won't just say blatantly and objectively false statements. So, that's at least a baseline you can generally rely on when you're evaluating what your opponents are saying.
Not being said, that's not always true. I mean, people will lie to force through a thing, but a lot of the time people will, when they're bluffing, they won't lie because they have to make it believable a lot of the time. If somebody goes for like 2 tutors and then passes, and you're just like, you have a one in hand, and they're just like, no, I tutored for lands. Like that's not believable, right? But like there's on that range, but like they will usually admit to be like, yeah, I tutored strong cards, but like they'll try to mislead you on what they are rather than just like denying that they're good cards.
Yeah, and as Reed was saying, in terms of not just asking a single person on who's the threat or to get clarification on the board state or for help in making assessments, but asking the whole table, right? Because if you ask one person, you're going to get their biased perspective on maybe some other people, but not themselves. But if you're asking everyone sort of what their position is, you're probably going to arrive somewhere close to the truth where they're going to, each other person is going to be making a pretty compelling case for the other two. Or yourself if you're for some reason you're trying to figure out if you're the most ahead. But yeah, they'll make a compelling case for the other players, and then you can kind of take all those accounts into consideration and arrive at a conclusion based off those. Whoever makes the most compelling argument.
One thing I will say as well, though, is keep in mind that we've been focusing a lot on winning, but winning is not the only threat an opponent can present to you in the course of a game. So when you are asking people for their threat assessment, keep that in mind. An example, I played several games against scumbag metagame Lyndon on his Anafenza deck. And if I'm on some sort of grave, like let's say I'm on Flash Hulk and he's on Anafenza, like him being in the game is a threat to me. But if you're on some deck that doesn't care about the graveyard, that's not nearly as much of a threat to you. So keep that in mind. If you ask me, I have a very real and from my perspective, Lyndon actually is a bigger threat than he is from your. It's not that I'm exaggerating. It's just I have different things that are threats to me.
Yeah, that's why it's important to get everyone's perspective. Also, as Morgan was saying, people. So even if it's not something like just stacks, where one person is shut out of the game through stacks. Games in cEDH, they're won when someone resolves a flash and gets their Protean Hulk trigger, but they can also be won a lot earlier in the game and grind your matchups. They can be won on when someone resolves their turn 3 or turn 2.
Smothering Tithe?
Rhystic Study.
Or Smothering Tithe.
Rhystic Study.
Even
Mystic
like,
Remore that sticks around for a long time.
When somebody sticks a Carpet of Flowers, and that just gets let through because as an example, but when nobody has the answer, the counterspell for the turn 1 or turn 2 Carpet of Flowers, and then it just sort of sticks around that. And
then somebody has 4 islands in play, and you're like, wait a minute. Black Lotus every turn.
But yeah, just there's a lot to it, but don't take your time. Look around, take in the information. Don't be afraid to ask if you're missing information.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to some other points here. Next up, we've kind of covered this a bit, but that's going to be making educated guesses at how likely each opponent is to have a win on their next turn in order to determine who is actually a threat.
But not just a win. This interaction and
This involves being able to. I think this is something we've talked about in previous episodes. Being able to read people's cards that they have in hand is a skill that,
or even just
you develop over time through experience a lot.
Not even necessarily exact cards a lot of the time. You don't have to start out being okay, I have to read their exact hand this time, and
it certainly helps later on.
I do think it's good to get into the practice of hey, I'm gonna try to figure out what the composition of his hand is, right? If they went for land Dork, slam Timna, as opposed to Dork develop value engine out of their hand, you could be okay, well maybe they're light on actual things they can commit to the board. Maybe they have a bunch of tutors, or maybe they have a cantrip and some counter magic or stuff like that. But they're hey, they didn't commit any more Dorks to the board. They went for the Timna. They're probably looking to shore up the hand, or they don't have anything to commit, right? So just working on hey, why did they make that play? Why would they go for that play or instead of playing some other card or doing something else, right?
And speaking of turn 2 Timnas, one of the things that I make a point of saying this in a lot of games, specifically when we're talking about opening hands, unless they went to 4, everyone kept their opening hand for a reason. There's a reason they looked at those 7 cards and went, yeah, these are good. I'm going to try and win starting from here. And if you haven't seen that reason yet, maybe just keep an eye out. If they go they stumble on 2 or 3 mana, going they stumble, they're not casting their value engines, they're not doing this. It's okay, but they kept that hand knowing there was a risk they would stumble on mana. And so whatever was in that hand was good enough to justify that risk. So be ready when they get themselves righted again and draw the mana they need.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah,
predicting future threat, sort of, right? Like, yeah, they're not a threat now because they don't have the mana, but when they do draw the mana, it's going to be a problem. So
yeah, and in terms of reading exact cards in people's hands, I tend to find this is important for reading the interaction available at the table. So if you can read what kinds of mana people are keeping open, if someone is not keeping up double blue, you can maybe put them on like a negate or delay versus counterspell mana drain. And if they're pausing extra long on certain, if someone casts a Sylvan Library or a Ristic Study and someone says it pauses a bit, for a bit too long on their priority, you might put them on, Force of Will, Force of Negation, something like that. Those are important cards to keep in mind in the back of your head in terms of evaluating whether or not someone else is how threatening someone else is and how likely your chances of winning are. Because if you put the table on, a Force of Will, let's say you somehow read a Flusterstorm or something like that, those are important cards to know about because they're pretty hard to answer. Especially like Flusterstorm or Force of Will, harder to read for some players and keep up enough counter magic to protect it. So maybe the Flash Hulk player isn't your biggest worry because the table has enough interaction for that. But maybe someone who's going to be trying to resolve something like a creature-based combo, like a let's say they're a Godo deck or a Gitrog deck. Gitrog with the Gitrog plus discard outlet; those are both creatures. Or Godo already has like a Panharmonicon or something in play and just needs to resolve Godo. If you don't have a read on good creature-based disruption, that player might actually be more threatening than the Flash Hulk player, just based on the type of interaction that you've got to read on. Also,
just sort of in this vein, because we've been talking about like making reads for this entire time. The general concept to take away from this isn't like that you, again, absolutely need to read everything, or even that like you need to specifically focus on that in every game. But like, I think just the general idea that like hidden information tends to be as important or more important than the public information of like cards on the table.
Yeah. And then you can get information about that hidden information, or you can ascertain certain aspects of that hidden information from the way people play.
And just
the game.
like it's sort of just like a logic puzzle sometimes, where like it's just like it's not like I feel like a lot of people like look at it in sort of the wrong way, where they're like, okay, well, this means that he has exactly this card, or like this specific thing means that he can only be doing, or it means that they can only be doing like this game plan, or they're only going for this, where like a lot of the time it's just more of a thing where you're like, okay, so that the fact that I have this information, the fact that they had that card on board, or that they played that card this turn, means that they're not doing this. And it's more of like a process of elimination rather than like nailing one specific thing.
Mm-hmm. So I think we can move on to the next point, and that is about more hidden information versus public information stuff. That's about black tutors. So black tutors, because they say any card, search your library for a card, anyway. Put that into your hand. You're able to conceal that information. So black hidden tutors are generally more threatening than revealed tutors, even though you don't actually see the card.
It sounds
and generally
obvious.
speaking, a hidden tutor is a lot more mana efficient, or works better with sequencing. But you have to realize that the hidden information can almost be better than that. I guess
There's a joke at QMTG of the Matt special, which is Merchant Scroll for Mystical Tutor for Demonic Tutor.
Dude, Yawgmoth's Will is a fantastic.
Dude, you gotta hide what you're going for. Dude, you got that spicy tech. You're just like, no, you're not seeing this one. But yeah, I did just want to
be aware of how many tutors people are casting. So even if you're not aware of the card they found, someone casts a demonic tutor and they don't immediately drop a mana crypt or something like that, you should be quite aware that they've got something very powerful in there.
Yeah, because like this is like sort of an obvious one when you just like read it and just like, yeah, like that makes sense. Like the card that gets anything is better than the card that gets one thing. But it's sort of like a thing, this sort of like weird paradox that I've noticed where people just like don't, it's like not seeing the card art or something like that means that they just don't make the association that they have a good card in their hand. Like if you're not actively,
don't know what they have in their hand, right?
If you're not actually like actively thinking about it, you just like a lot of the time it's just like, oh, well, he cast a tutor. It's basically like he drew a card, right? Like it's hidden information either way. But like it's definitely
you see someone put a bunch of mouse traps into a bag, and then there's the other. They put something else in the other bag, and you're not sure. You're like, damn, that bag of mouse traps. I don't want to stick my hand in there. But in reality, the other bag is just a bear traps. Yeah.
And this point may be a bit tangential, but tutors that reveal can also be used to mislead threat assessment, right? Like if you have some spare tutors and you're ready to win, it's like all worldly tutor for Dryad Arbor. Spooked.
No, that is an intense amount of levels of depth. That's like 5 levels of Yomi, but
honestly, one of the scariest plays I see is not a mystical tutor for Flash, it's a mystical tutor for Force of Will. Like,
hot take, that's a terrible play and you shouldn't do it.
It's okay. Well, yes.
I mean, certainly there's probably better cards to mystical tutor for, like a Veil of Summer or something, but the idea being that if they're spending their reveal tutors not on setup cards,
on the obvious
interaction
ones that you're expecting them to tutor, right? Like everybody's expecting them to tutor Flash when they cast any of their tutors, right? So when they tutor anything else than that, that's when it starts to get scary.
Yeah, the correct assumption is not necessarily, oh, they don't have Flash. The correct assumption might well be, oh, they have Flash already. And that's not always true. You know, sometimes they've made the call that whatever it is that they are getting is actually more beneficial, or they're worried about losing, faster than they think they can find the Protean Hulk.
And definitely making the conservative call of like always thinking that everybody has it can lead you to lose games because you play too conservatively, but
yeah, like certainly don't just assume that because they didn't get the piece you expect, the card you expected them to get, that they don't have it, because like they're making their decisions for a reason, right? If it was like, well, why would they tutor, obviously Dryad Arbor was an extreme example, but
yes, yeah.
Sometimes it might be correct to tutor a value piece as opposed to a combo piece, or a piece of...
Sometimes the value tutor, like if like Matt was saying, tutor for a Dryad Arbor, it might be more realistic to say something like tutor for a Dark Confidant. Sometimes that's a hedge against a combo attempt failing, right? Like you're if you don't have a Grand Abolisher or something you can find with your worldly tutor that's going to help protect your combo, you might just be trying to go for it and then follow that up with a value piece, and if things don't go your way.
So basically spend all your games as a paranoid, nervous wreck. Basically.
Yeah.
No, I think, like, obviously they don't always have it, but we just want to caution against, because you see them not getting it, like, when they get it, they have it. When they don't get it, that doesn't mean they don't have it.
And it usually means that when you don't know what they're getting, it's usually worse than what you think they're getting, or it's at least as good as what you think they're getting.
All right,
but you know what you do when they tutor for ad nauseum? You attack them.
Speaking of ad nauseum,
we're going to talk about the combat threat assessment part of this podcast.
Very briefly,
this is everyone's favorite. Oh, sorry, Morgan. Do you want to, before I continue the segue, you have something to say?
Oh, yeah. I guess I'll fit this in with with the information about stacks pieces, or not so much stacks pieces, but hate pieces. One thing that I see people do is they overestimate the effectiveness of a hate piece. Like, certain hate pieces are extraordinarily effective. For example, Rest in Peace against Gitrog. Like, yeah, the Gitrog monster, they don't want to keep it in play because they're just sacking their lands and not drawing. So the Gitrog monster is probably going to go out of play quickly, and then, yeah, it's hard for them to win. But something like a Grafdigger's Cage against Flash Hulk, Like, I've seen people, basically, it's like the Grafdigger's Cage comes down, and they go like, oh, the Hulk player can't win, so let's ignore them and, be greedy or focus on tap out, whatever.
Yeah.
They can't win.
Meanwhile, they tutor 3 times.
And, it's not actually that hard to remove a Grafdigger's Cage. There are several spells in the deck that do it, and there are even more that find them.
Some are uncounterable.
Some that are uncounterable. So don't, just because somebody's hated out by one or sometimes even 2 pieces, if they're just stopping their win and they're not stopping them from developing, tutoring, interacting, all of those things, like, don't just ignore them, right? You have to keep in mind that Grafdigger's Cage represents one more piece that the Hulk player needs to find, not anything more than that.
Good piece of advice. Okay, and now I'll return back to my segue. Speaking of ad nauseum, so one of the most common pieces of threat assessment that people are gonna that people gripe about
it's
all
also
the time.
It's the first one that you learn when you get into the format. Like as soon as you play your first game of cEDH and then you take your 2/2 vanilla and you're like, I'm gonna attack the mono blue player, and everybody's like, no,
people freak out. Yeah,
you can't do that.
Wait a second, that's illegal. Yeah. So yes, attacking the ad nauseum / necropotence players. Your life is a resource. When you can trade that resource in for cards, every single piece of life that you take away from them is 1 card out of their hand on when they cast ad nauseum or resolve their necropotence and start drawing cards. So there is a weird hierarchy in terms of how to evaluate who's the best person to attack. It's also one thing I just want to say. This is a general rule of thumb, but it doesn't always end up being the case that you want to attack the Adnos / Necro player. There are times when you're going to want to attack a control Tasigur player or something like that, because in the very late game that you will not be able to close out the game through all their interaction, and that you need to get them somehow. So there are cases where it's not a set in stone rule, but for the most part, you're going to want to follow this guideline.
And on that point too, you don't have to attack the Adnos player until they're dead. You just have to attack the Adnos player until their ad nauseum doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. Sometimes you don't want them dead. Sometimes you want them for their counter magic in hand.
Almost certainly on blue.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So here's the brief matrix of the who to attack first with the Adnos Necro player. So let's spin a little scenario here. You've got a Shimmerzer player,
Attack
you've got a
Gitrog
Gitrog player,
You've
got a Kest player, and you've got a CST player. Everyone in that pod is running ad nauseum. I think everyone, depending on the list, is running necropotence.
We'll safely assume that everybody's running necropotence here.
Yeah. So this is first of all, you're not going to run into pods like this all the time. So you might have one of those players might be subbed out with a Najeela. You're not going to be attacking the Najeela player. I'm sorry. You're not going to be spending your attacks.
You don't know my life. I play
player.
flyers for a reason.
Yeah, so you're going to want to be focusing down the player who has most consistent access to necropotence / ad nauseum, or whose primary strategy is most built around it. So I would say Zur, as Morgan, Matt, and Reed all pointed out, is the person you're going to target first. The reason being is they have Zur, which is going to tutor necropotence. So it's necropotence in the command zone, as everyone likes to say.
And they also
if they're a Shimmer Zur, like that's one of their primary strategies. It might be their plan A or plan B, but
they also have
you significantly decrease their odds of winning if you start hitting their life.
Something to note is that they Shimmerzer also has the highest, I probably subjective, but in that pod probably has the highest rate of paying life into something for getting win percentage out of paying that life.
Yep.
So the more you hit them, you're getting way more percentage per damage than hitting any of the other decks.
I think Suasion has a thing on his primer for Shimmerzer where he shows like the hypergeometric distribution for cards drawn versus win percentage. And
that's pretty cool.
Once you take them past a certain point, like their win percentage starts to tank heavily. Like a Shimmerzer trying to combo off after drawing 10 cards is kind of pathetic compared to a Shimmerzer player drawing 30 cards.
But even less extreme, 20 cards.
Yep.
Yeah.
Every card matters. So, and then following up on that in that pod, Gitrog is often a very primary attack target for these for threat assessment. Most people would pick Gitrog after Zur. I would argue that I think Kess is actually the one you want to hit next after Zur, due to the fact that Ad Nauseam it's a solid thing you can do in Gitrog, same with Necropotence, but you're not as dependent on it for a win condition as you are in something like Kess.
But that I would be inclined to agree, but there's you start adding in more and more things. Like the joke is attack Zur first, because Zur is so vastly disproportionately likely to try and use their life total to generate advantage compared to any other deck. But
I suppose it also depends on if it's a consult cast versus
consult cast versus storm cast. But also, like, beyond Zur, who's sort of the obvious attack, this is where you start trying to factor in sort of less just about the deck list and more about the game state. So does somebody have Crypt? Does somebody have Library? Even something like a Tarnished Citadel might represent, it's like, you know what? If they're going to be dealing 6 to 9 damage to themselves, then maybe, this extra 5 to 10, is more meaningful than if they're not doing that.
Even like they did something early, so they have they powered out something early, so they have like a Tab Mana Vault, and they also happen to have they have like a Mana Confluence in play. Like, they have like an Elves of Deep Shadow. Well, that's like 3 life a turn if they want to use all their mana. So, like, just, like, considering all sources of, like, where they might be taking damage from, or, like, where... Yeah.
Incidental damage,
like,
yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's just, how much more your points of damage will put them toward them not being able to... Or them really having to consider whether or not they're going to be able to use those sources of damage anymore.
And another thing to consider is whether or not you can deal enough damage for it to be meaningful in the near future. So if you're attacking somebody who, like, for example, attacking Kess is usually, like, it's not a bad thing to do, but if you're putting, 3 damage on Kess, and then you're expecting them to just slam Kess next turn and have a 3/4 flyer, then, you're getting 3 damage on Kess. But if there's somebody at the table who also might want to use their life total, but doesn't have easy access to a 3/4 flying blocker, then, maybe it makes sense to put the damage on them so you can actually take them off the threat sooner rather than them just, getting in 3 damage and then, I guess I have to attack somebody else now.
Yeah, it's like...
Was there a Thrasios in our
There is. There's a CST player.
Yeah. So I would say that, like, depending on how clogged up the board state is, especially if, like, the Kess player and the Zur player have been dealt with by, a lot of untapped mana or permanent based, disruption, I would probably go for the Thrasios player, because in my mind they have the most inevitability, or at least the better endgame among that set of decks.
Yeah, certainly comparable. It's like Gitrog or the Thrasios Tymna in terms of ability to grind out.
And depending on, like, what removal and game state and mana looks like, yeah. But also,
speaking of
Thrasios this is my point. This is my point. I wrote this in the show notes. This is my point. Speaking of Thrasios and Tymna, another big thing about, like, determining who you're attacking and determining threat assessment that way is you have to make the decision of whether or not you actually want to attack. Because a lot of the time, you'll see a Kess player go like, yeah, I'm gonna attack 3 damage onto Zur because I want to, because that seems like the thing to do. And they realize that they open themselves up to a Tymna beat, and suddenly Tymna player's up a life and draw an extra card that turn, and the Kess player also took 2 damage for swinging out with Kess. So just like considering whether or not you actually want to attack.
Yeah, definitely.
Welcome to the modern cEDH metagame.
Definitely one of the things I see that the most with is people who get Gilded Drakes in decks that don't run a lot of creatures. Like their commander gets Gilded Draked, and they have this Gilded Drake, and they're like, well, this isn't my commander. I guess it's just a dumb creature that I attack with. And then, yeah, it's like, oh,
you fool,
deal
it's
3
a
damage.
Tymna
I'm like,
blocker.
Yes,
like, are you really trading 3 damage on one of your opponents to let possibly one of your other opponents draw a card? Like,
Well, yeah, just remember what you're dealing damage for, right? You're trading. You're trying to deal damage to reduce the amount of cards that they could potentially get out of an Ad Nauseam or Necropotence. Whereas if you're leaving yourself vulnerable as an open attacker, your opponent is just actually drawing cards immediately from that exchange,
and potentially also gaining life from the exchange.
God, yeah. So Tymna having lifelink, my God. We've talked about that.
What
enough.
a fact! Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we can move on to one of our last points, not the last one, but one of our last ones, and that's going to be weakening opponents with known answers increases the threat of others.
I'd like to bring
Morgan, I
Zur
feel
back
like-
up for this one
Yeah,
because
sure, Matt,
I hate
go
to
for
pick
it.
on Zur, but if you do reduce their life total to a certain point, they're now the player who keeps up the mana because they have to play late and they have to keep their counter spells and their removal up. So I would say that like they are certainly not the target at that point because they are actually the ones providing the answers rather than you.
I would also say people tend to take Zur lower than I think you need to. I think Zur is pretty. So in a standard like Shimmer pile, you're going to leave yourself with maybe like 4 or 5 life because you want to have 1 life for a free Force of Will, so that you can counter whatever people are trying to do, and then another 2 life for like a Vampiric Tutor, yeah, or like a quickened Imperial Seal, something like that. So 15 life. If the Zur player's at 15 life, I generally feel comfortable stopping there for the most part because they're going to maybe get 10 cards off of a Necropotence, which if you look at the hypergeometric distribution is not the best odds for winning. So the Zur player most likely is not going to try to go for that kind of win. Now you do have to be aware that the Zur player is not out of the game. They've still got Angel's Grace Ad Nauseam or consult wins, but you're no longer worrying about them, trying to shimmer if that's what you're doing. So learning when to slow down on the aggression and direct it elsewhere is certainly important.
Yeah, just like recognize when you've achieved the goal that you want to achieve with combat damage.
If you make it so that if you bring the Zur player to 5 life, and then it just means that a Gitrog player because Zur does not put up a lot of blockers, and Zur gets countered a lot, so it's very likely it's not likely that they're going to be able to block with Zur, or it's quite likely that Zur is not going to be able to deal with all, if there's like a board full of like Tymna attackers and things like that someone who's going to try to combo out might just go to take out the Zur player in 1 swing before trying to combo out, and then that's just 1 player less to worry about in terms of counter magic. So you want to have them in like a kind of buffer zone where you don't want them to be at so low life that 1 player can just kind of take them out in 1 swing before they try to combo.
Yeah, like and just more generally, not just leaving people alive, but when talking about where to spread damage, we mentioned a hypergeometric distribution, and if you think of it sort of like a bell curve, where taking them from a 40 card ad nauseum to a 35 card ad nauseum like doesn't really matter. They're almost certainly going to win either way. Taking them from a 25 card ad nauseum to a 20 card ad nauseum, that really matters. Like in the middle, it's much more that's where most of the effect is.
Taking someone from a 10
taking
card
someone
to an
from a
8
10 card to a 5 card ad nauseum takes them from not winning the game off an ad nauseum to not winning the game off an ad nauseum. So,
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's not true. I saw an ad nauseum on like 12 life that just hit Labman, Demonic Consultation, Preordain. I was like, yeah, I guess that does it.
I have Adnos from 8 life and Virals and won the game on the untap.
I've done
my
a plunge into darkness for like 15 and Gitrog, taken an ad nauseum, hit Ulamog off my first thing and still won on that same turn. So
But
I was
it can
playtesting this.
happen, but it's rare.
yeah.
I was playtesting this Razaketh deck that had a plan that was like, if you don't have enough creatures, just tutor for sacrifice and Adnaz, and then try to Adnaz. And so it actually worked a surprising amount of times.
Wow.
One deck that might actually be higher on the attack me first totem pole than Zur, if you happen to see it, although it's not exactly common, is
Oh,
Crick.
yes.
The DC ad
Oh,
nauseum.
Crick.
Crick.
Yeah.
Oh, Crick, yeah.
The deck where
Crick.
the Doomsday pile costs exactly 40 life from start to finish. Or 39. rather.
39.
It's quite poetic.
Wait, what?
Oh, and
I
I'd
didn't know
also
that.
be
That's funny.
I'd kick myself if I didn't hit my Godo mention for the episode, of course. And that's going to be Treasonous Ogre,
Yep,
and Godo is
yep.
something you need to be aware of.
Get them under multiples of 3.
But that's one. Yeah, so they need 11 mana to combo from absolutely nothing, just casting Godo, finding Helm, equipping Helm. So you should be aware of, the surprise Treasonous Ogre. Get them down to where they, if it only takes a couple hits to get the Godo player
You
off
want
the
them to
Treasonous Ogre
33 or
line.
under.
You just need to get them. Yeah, exactly. But then also that's going to scale depending on the later the game as to get more mana, right? So you might want to kind of chip in every now and then to make sure they can't get a Treasonous Ogre off. But yeah, they don't. You don't have to get them down to like 15, like with most ad nauseum decks.
And one more thing, I think Matt touched on this briefly when he mentioned inevitability, but it's not just about people turning their life total into cards. If for whatever reason you're not particularly worried about that threat, you should start looking at people who, like, the decks that are more favored to win, the longer the game goes, it's better to put damage on them. Like if
Yeah, I mentioned that.
yeah,
with
you
the
mentioned
Tasker.
Tasker as well, but just
Turning turns into threat.
turning
Yeah.
Or is, like
like
Yeah.
I play I have my Muldrotha deck, and yes, there's the Zur's weirding that sometimes does silly things with life totals, but also just if I'm trying to make the game last like 15 turns, like that's a lot of time for a Mana Crypt or some Pain Lands or like a Swan from Swan Song to put in some beats. So if that's my plan, like the longer the game goes, the more resource advantage I have. So don't let me live through a long game.
Yeah. So like get them down
And
to like
don't exclude.
Which
Yeah,
brings me
don't
to my
exclude
next point, which
beats.
is Morgan dies first.
Yes,
Every
of course. Always.
always.
Yeah, don't exclude beats as a way to close out the game. A non like I was gonna say a non-zero, but it's actually I think a more than you would expect number of cEDH games actually end through combat damage.
Don't dedicate your strategy or a lot of card choices to it, but make sure that it's factoring into your decision making.
Some stacks your decks run Elish Norn and they'll close out the game through Elish Norn.
Think
But
about
these are more
combat.
haymaker cards.
And again, I
was gonna say in Keegan. So we mentioned Keegan's primer for Urza at
Dude,
the
that fucking
top of the show,
construct.
but he is one like I think he says in the primer something like 1/3 of his games, and maybe even if that's a bit exaggerated, I wouldn't put it less than like 1/5 of his games winning through just stacking out the game and using construct beats. Combat damage is real, so sometimes you need to be aware of closing out the game.
And I know
damage.
Constructs do get better the more
Yes.
you have them.
I know cEDH players have no idea how combat works, and I know everybody ever forgot how First Strike works. And we had to actually go look at the rules text for that in an actual game of cEDH because nobody remembered how First Strike worked. But
did you remember how
just explained,
trample works?
Yeah, dude.
Yeah. I just explained how a Chains of Mephistopheles interacts with Notion Thief to someone at a table, and then I go to attack, and Morgan had to correct me on how trample works.
but even more reason to think about combat when you're in a game. Make sure it factors into your decision making. It doesn't matter in the games where everybody dies on turn 3 to whatever. It doesn't matter in the games where like somebody just resolves an ad nauseam and wins, but make sure that when you're attacking, you have purpose behind the attack. Make sure that when you're not attacking, you have a purpose for not attacking, right?
When you have creatures doing combat right is free. Like there's no cost to making sure you're doing the right attacks and blocks. You didn't have to include special cards in your deck to make it happen, but it can pick up points here and there.
Yep. And the last point on our topic, we kind of wrote it as a joke, which is Reed always has it, don't listen to his lies. But this kind of segues into just players talking, and cEDH is a lot more political than people
it's a social
give it
format,
credit
all right.
for. Yeah. People are constantly trying to manipulate each other into incorrect threat assessment, misevaluating cards, making incorrect attacks, doing all these kinds of things. So we talked about asking the people for who's the threat, but be wary of just letting someone's comment get into your head and you just internalizing without you should have some sort of like mental firewall up that just whenever someone says something, you run it past that little firewall and then you decide whether or not there's something you want to take into play. Like I was playing with friend of the show Dave, and he was coming off with Kest Storm, and he's like, I think I mentioned on his turn, I was like, oh damn, Dave's just gonna mystical tutor for Yawgmoth's Will and then we're done. And he's like, yeah, okay, I think I'm going to find Yawgmoth's Will. He goes to cast it. I'm like, there's a Grafdigger's Cage in play, buddy.
Dude, oh my god. I've had so many times recently where especially this last game, I'll keep parties anonymous, but I had an Aven Mind Sensor out and just talking through plays that don't necessarily work through an Aven Mind Sensor and making them think that they're viable plays.
Yeah.
And one of the things we've been focusing a lot on, like we've touched somewhat on interaction, but one other thing is when you put people on interaction, sometimes it's appropriate to take risks that they might not have it to force them to use it. Like certain people will basically just do everything they can to avoid interacting, and then they'll go for a win with like 6 counter spells. Reed always has it, don't listen to his lies. And this is something I see a lot, that people, like, they just, there's something that they really want countered, or like potentially even need countered, like represents a game-ending threat. And like, if you really think about it, there's like a 95% chance that whoever it is who's behind you in priority has the answer. Like, that 5% risk that they don't have it is often smaller than the risk of you tapping out to interact and letting them keep their interaction for when they try and win. So you aren't responsible for interacting with everything. You can take risks to draw interaction out of people.
So this wasn't planned, but I break this down in great detail in the Shuffle Primer, so if you want to read more about it, go look at that, because I actually did do that right up on this, and this is actually one of the things that I cover extensively in that primer.
Yeah, that was what reminded me of it, is that Reed does that endlessly. Eternally frustrating to watch people just let him answer.
No, dude, I don't play answers.
Yeah, so I think that wraps up our primary topic for threat assessment. If you guys have any comments or anything you'd like to share that we didn't cover, join us on the Discord, and we'd love to participate in that kind of discussion. But it is now time for everyone's favorite segment, Gut Check.
Good check.
Gut check.
Come on.
My gut's doing great. Thanks for asking.
Okay. So my gut check for you guys this time is: which deck do you think has the highest skill ceiling in the
Oh
format?
boy, what a meme.
Oh,
And
geez.
I was thinking on this for a bit, and honestly, I'm not even how confident. I'm not super confident in my answer, but I think there's a case for it.
I have my answer. I feel like it might be the same as yours.
I think I also have my answer.
got a bit of
It
a
might be
meme,
similar. We'll see.
But
Lenon's going to keep his proud tradition of answering Godo.
all right. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. My pick is Cast Storm. I think some Stormlines are pretty straightforward, but to pilot that deck, to pilot Storm at the highest level, definitely requires some things.
Thanks,
so
buddy.
Doomsday could be. Hey, man, I'm not saying you can pilot at the highest ability. But yeah, it's like Stormlines can be a lot like Doomsday piles, where you need to get very creative. Okay, I'm done. That's my spiel.
I guess I'll go next because I have the same answer, Kestorm, for the same reasons. Like, you put that pretty well.
Okay, I feel like Morgan has the same answer, so I'll let him go first.
I mean, it's not exactly the same. It's similar. I was going to say, like, it was Manual Storm, so Kest Storm and Shimmerzer were the two that have just the number of lines that are possible, and a lot of the times those lines involving using cards in maybe unintuitive ways, like dramatic reversal. Like those, there's a lot like going on there. I've seen a lot more people play Shimmerzer, so maybe that's why I was leaning more towards that one, but they are both very similar in that classification in my mind.
Okay, Reed, let's hear you say Shufflehawk. Just get it
Actually,
over with.
surprisingly, because you didn't mention power level at all and just mentioned difficulty, I'm still gonna name.
You're gonna say Hackball?
I'm gonna.
Well, I said
I
in
know.
the format.
I'm still gonna mention cEDH decks. Just like I
Sure.
don't think that
Some random
dude.
pauper brew.
I don't think that the hardest decks in the format are necessarily some of the better decks in the format. I personally would
That's
say
fair.
it's like between three, but like I can get the general point across. But I think it's low color blue decks that are like basically okay. I think JVP is a very difficult deck to play correctly. And I think it's
Because there's
the
no way to
epitome-
play that deck
exactly.
correctly.
It's the epitome. JVP is the epitome of the deck that's like very, very, very difficult to play, hyper easy to play against.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh
it is
my God,
it is
man.
not a good storm deck, but it is very difficult.
Okay,
to
rule
play
of thumb:
correctly.
if you're gonna play mono blue, just be ready to block, please, please.
Yeah. Please.
Unless I'm playing
Yeah.
Timna, in which case, whatever.
Did you have anything? You said you had a couple decks. Do you wanna-
The other one, I couldn't decide between these two, so I'm going to list both of them. But it was between that and also low color control. So like Brawl and Rashmi, I think are incredibly difficult decks to play, but like they're not good. But like I do think
I
that
can see
playing
the case
Brawl
for
and
those,
Rashmi, because they're effectively the same deck, but I think playing that collective deck is a very, very difficult thing to do in like in an optimal manner. Just because the number of
guess that's-
decisions
you know,
and
I
the
think
difficulty.
I
to
kind
win.
of want to comment. I know gut check. We're not supposed to like comment too much, but I kind of want to comment on Reed's thing, where Matt, Morgan, and I kind of picked decks that are difficult to pilot in terms of execution in like for the winning the game portion. But Reed picked a deck or like in like control, for instance, that requires high skill in threat assessment and politics to pilot that deck at its at its maximum
But also
skill level.
knowledge of like what your role is.
Yeah, you need to know the other decks. If you're playing control, you need to know the other decks like almost flawlessly. You need to know when to sandbag, how to sandbag. You need to have a good poker face, and manipulate people. Like you need to operate on all those kinds of fronts.
I would say
Yeah.
Matt, Lyndon, and I pick decks that are easy to play, like are easy to play incorrectly, and Reed picked a deck that is hard to play correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good summary.
My one joke answer is actually, sorry, you go first.
Like, just, it's easy, like, it's very easy to mess up Stormlines. But that is only one part of the game, and it's an important one, but certainly a lot of the decisions that come before that can add up to be very important in a less obvious way.
Okay, man, what's your joke? What's your joke answer?
Yeah, the hardest deck, maybe not to pilot, but definitely to memorize is Food Chain Niv, because you just have to know all the jank multicolored cards in the format.
Dude, Corpse Knight made that deck so easy to build. God damn it.
Wow.
Wizards and their fucking power creep.
I would recite that one, but it's just so obvious.
Remember everyone laughing at me for my consuming aberration that's been like mana drained and swords and assassin's trophy?
All right.
Yeah, you're right.
It's like, I'll play this 38-38.
Can we get an F in chat for Niv Miss It again?
F
He died so
I know
young.
we've asked for F in chat before, yeah, but another F. Okay, so before we close out, we've got a listener question from a patron, because patrons get priority listener questions. So this comes from patron Morality18. What do you do when you really screwed up? Got a game with Food Chain Sliver and realistically all win cons were removed. I know that spite pacting is kind of frowned upon, but if you know there is no win con left, do you concede or sit through it?
So, I mean, first of all, I have to reject the premise of this question, because the first Sliver always
Sliver is
has
a
a win
7/7?
condition. It is a 7/7. That is a clock. Like that, no joke.
Yeah,
But there are
it's not
decks
good
where
for
that's
sure.
less realistic. So that's
Yeah.
when this question becomes a little more like, Zur as an example. You're not going to kill people with Zur.
Yeah,
beats.
like if Zur is like necro locked, like it's over. It's
game's
all
done.
over. Yeah, you're basically hoping for someone to time
Nature's
twister
claim you.
or some miracle. But
We had this exact same thing happen at GP Montreal.
I mean, it wasn't a necro lock. Like the Zur. So the Zur game was not completely over, because I did end up going for another win attempt, but it was like really unlikely. I would have rather scooped up that game, but I kind of left it to my opponents. So one thing that's kind of, if there is only one pod that you're playing in, like scooping it up feels kind of weird, right? Like I'm just gonna pack my shit up, unless you have to actually like go somewhere. I think it's generally preferable that you sit and wait it out until you're actually dead. Maybe you beg people to put you out of your misery, but
And they refuse.
that's aside from the point. Whereas in this case, there's at JP Montreal, there was all kinds of different pods firing, and I would like to. This game is pretty much over for me, so I would like to, ideally kind of wrap it up and go on and play some other game. But I didn't just scoop it up, even though I if it was up to me, I would have. I said to everyone else in the pod, if any of you want me to stay in this game, I will stay in the game. And I think it was Morgan who's like, yeah, I kind of want you staying in the game. And for some of the reasons like we addressed in this episode itself, right? When a player is that low, you still are kind of relying on them for counter spells and whatnot, interaction, and sometimes irrelevant as attackers. You're an open Timna, you're open for Timna beats. the Timna store is open. So I think it's generally the correct thing to do is to ask the pod if they're fine with it, unless you actually have some external commitment that you need to.
I think that's a very
attend to.
graceful way to handle it, honestly. Ask if people will let you go, and if they will, then you can leave. I know that you can't always get that though, and it's not always realistic to just be able to ask the table and leave. I mean, depending on both situation and like how you're feeling, maybe you like just really don't want to play the game anymore. It's just not something that you're down to sit around and watch the game for another like half hour. I also get that. What I would say is once you're at the point in the game where you basically have zero hope of winning at all, just try to be graceful about it. Don't be like spite pacting or like doing like things just to mess with people. If you know that like you're not winning the game anyway and you're not doing anything there anyway, I think it's reasonable to like try to not die, but like don't go out of your way to just mess with people. And then if you are going to concede, I will always 100% of the time recommend conceding at sorcery speed, because I think it's the most graceful way to bow out of a game is to wait until your turn and then draw your card, go to your main, and then go, okay, now I'm conceding.
Honestly, I think if you're just bowing out because you think you can't win, I would go even farther than that and warn people.
That's fair.
Like for, sorcery speed is good. It's better than instant speed, but, if I, like, tap low on my turn, I'm like, well, the Xur player doesn't have win cons and has a bunch of cards in hand, and I tap low, and then Xur player untaps, goes, cool, concede. It's like, okay, well, I certainly made decisions based on, information that wasn't really accurate. So if you say, like, it's your turn, you say, like, okay, on my next turn I'm going to concede, or something like that. I would say the two things that you sort of have two options, which is one, you can try and leave the game as gracefully as possible using some of the strategies we've laid out here. And the other thing is, or you can play as if you still have a way to win. Like, whatever, you know what, I'm going to try and beat people to death with this Kess. I'm going to counter them trying to win. I'm going to, answer threats as if there was still a lab man in my deck. Even though there isn't, like, I'm not just going to start pointing interaction around randomly or, doing silly things. I'm going to play, as tight as possible, as if I can actually beat people to death with this Kess, if you're staying in the game.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention about Spite Pacting. This is kind of a really tough spot to evaluate whether or not it's a Spite Pact. So sometimes people will call it a Spite Pact if you simply cannot pay for it on your turn. Now, I think there's a bit of wiggle room on this front where
you can do some justifying,
yes. Kind of try to implement. Yeah. So one, because people have made the argument in the past where if you're immediately going to lose, you might as well Spite Pact, or you might as well pact because there's maybe, some miracle chance that you can still, win the game. Better, some 0.00001% chance is better than 0, so that's the most competitive play. I think there is a bit of a social contract that's kind of built into this, where my personal rule on it is that if you have some reasonable, if you were basically have only Pact of Negation in your hand and you're on like one land, there's almost no combination of cards that's going to get you there. So, that's a Spite Pact. I don't think it's worth doing.
But what if my opponent
if you're kind of sitting
Dogs
on
Extortionist, then donates me some treasure?
Yeah, dude.
Yeah. But if you're sitting on let's say 3 open mana or 4 open mana, and you've got a Brainstorm in hand, right? You could reasonably cast a Brainstorm and hit a Angel's Grace if you're running it to stop that pact, or you can find a Dark Ritual or Cabal Ritual.
Say you're on
there are ways
effects.
that you can pay for the pact. Exactly, like stifling the pact trigger. And the last thing I would say is that sometimes you can make a deal with people in terms of, I've got a Pact of Negation in hand. If you do everything in your power to like wheel next turn to or to stifle my pact trigger, then I will pack this. I think that's also acceptable.
And I would say also just don't be too quick to label things Spite Pacts.
Yes, think about it first.
Because like one of the, spite is certainly a question of intent, which can be hard to evaluate. Like I cast a pact on it was actually on a Wall of Roots recently that I couldn't pay for, but basically everyone except me, like everyone was tapped out, and the food chain player had just done a consultation, and I was like, they almost certainly have a counterspell, so they will counter my pact, and then they're short mana on their food chain or whatever it is because they want to try and go off this turn rather than wait for the cycle. And like they just went, okay, cool, I guess Wall of Roots is countered, and then I died to my pact. But like, that wasn't me just being like, no, screw you. It was me being like, I think you're going to counter this. And, they didn't, and I lost, but there was no spite involved in that play.
Okay. Well, before we close the show, I just want to say if there's one thing you want to take away from this episode, that's going to be that learn threat assessment in terms of combat, because cEDH players get really salty when you attack someone who's not the Adnos player. And with that about wraps it up for this episode. If you guys would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/Into the North Podcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo, and to our long-suffering podcast editor, Roadkill. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.
See ya.
Bye.
Have a good one.